Okay, I want you to close your eyes for a second. Picture a sound. It's got the heavy, repetitive bass line of 1970s funk.
Mm-hmm.
It's got the scratching and sampling of 80s hip-hop. But then, layered right on top of that, you've got these complex, wandering saxophone solos, maybe some flute, and this frantic Latin percussion.
It's a very specific, very recognizable texture, isn't it?
It is. And I have a confession to make right at the top. For a long time, I just filed this entire genre under background music, the stuff you hear in a boutique hotel lobby or a coffee shop that charges $7 for a latte.
The expensive latte soundtrack.
Yeah.
That's a very common misconception.
Exactly. But today, we're digging into a deep dive based on a fascinating column from Monumental Movement Records MMR for short called Acid Jazz, Fusion of Sound, Born from Club Culture and Urban Intellect.
Right.
And after reading this, I realized I had it all wrong. This wasn't just elevator music. The source calls it a cultural explosion.
It really was.
Yeah.
And that title, From MMR Urban Intellect, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting. It suggests this wasn't just about partying. It was about thinking.
So our mission today is to unpack that.
Yeah, we're going to look at how a very specific, somewhat weird collision of Thatcher-era politics, Caribbean immigration, and a sort of do-it-yourself punk attitude in London created a global phenomenon.
So we aren't just talking about catchy tunes here.
No, not at all. We're talking about a movement that redefined how the world listened to jazz. We're going to trace it from a few sweaty, smoke-filled basements in London all the way to, the high-gloss bubble economy of Tokyo and the post-Cold War clubs of Berlin.
Okay, so let's set the scene properly. Transport me. It's the late 1980s, London. What does it feel like to be there?
Well, it is definitely not the swinging 60s anymore. It's the Thatcher era. And this is crucial context. You have to imagine a post-industrial city. The manufacturing jobs are gone. The docks are closing down. It's gritty. There's a widening economic gap between the rich and the poor. And you've got these empty, decaying urban spaces everywhere. Warehouses just sitting empty.
So visually, it's bleak.
Visually, yes. But inside that decay, the pressure is building. The clubs are absolutely heating up. And that's where this starts as a reaction.
Okay, let's tackle the name first, because acid jazz has always sounded like a bit of an oxymoron to me. Was it literally jazz on acid? Because that sounds terrifying.
It does sound intense, doesn't it? But no, not quite. The name was actually a bit of a cheeky marketing ploy. It comes from a record label, Acid Jazz Records, started by two absolute legends of the scene, DJ Gilles Peterson and producer Eddie Piller.
Jill Peterson. That name pops up literally everywhere in music history.
He is the architect, really. And the story goes that they coined the term as a joke, a playful jab at the acid house scene that was exploding right next door.
Right. Acid house was the big thing then. Raves, smiley faces, electronic beeps, ecstasy.
Exactly. Acid house was intense, synthetic, very chemical. Peterson and Piller wanted to create a space for something else. They were pushing for a movement to reevaluate black music.
Okay.
They wanted the energy of the club, that sweat, that movement, that volume, but they wanted the soul of the past. They called it danceable jazz, or club-ready, soulful music.
So if acid house was for losing your mind, acid jazz was for finding it.
In a way, yeah. It was for engaging your mind while moving your feet. The source describes the musical DNA as a hybrid sensation. It wasn't one single genre. It was a crash collision of jazz, funk, soul, hip-hop, Latin, and something called rare groove.
Okay, pause there. Rare groove. I see this term a lot in the notes. Is that a genre? Like, can I go buy a rare groove album?
It's more of an activity than a genre. Rare groove is all about the practice of crate digging. DJs would go to record stores, find these dusty, obscure funk albums from the 1970s, stuff that slopped commercially or was forgotten, and they'd find the best 4 bars of a track.
Just a little snippet.
Maybe a drum break, maybe a bass line.
So it's basically musical archaeology.
That is a perfect way to put it. And that archaeology is central to the acid jazz sound. The source breaks down the key characteristics here, and the first one is sampling culture.
Which is borrowed directly from hip-hop, right?
100%. Even when acid jazz bands played live instruments, they were thinking like hip-hop producers. They were deconstructing old jazz funk records and rebuilding them. They'd take a breakbeat from a 1974 funk record, loop it, and then play a live sax solo right over it.
So it's improvisational. That's the jazz part, but it's groove-focused. That's the funk part.
And crucially, it's club-oriented. This is where jazz purists usually get annoyed. Traditional jazz is often, sit down, stroke your chin, appreciate the complexity. Acid jazz was designed for the dance floor. It was designed to keep people moving at 2 a.m.
The source uses the phrase urban sophistication, intellectual yet danceable.
That is the core tension. It's stylish. It has this mood of Latin percussion and soul vocals. It made you feel cool. It made you feel worldly.
I have a degree in philosophy, but I can also do the splits.
Maybe not the splits, but definitely a very rhythmic two-step.
But I want to go back to the location. Why London? Why then? You mentioned the Thatcher era. Why does political gloom lead to such groovy, upbeat music? Usually when people are angry about the economy, you get punk. You get anger.
That is the million-dollar question. And the article calls it the pressure cooker effect. The urban decay we talked about, the decline of manufacturing, it gave youth culture what the source calls a deconstructive set of values.
Deconstructive?
Meaning the old structures, the jobs, the social ladder, the city itself were falling apart. So young people felt free to take things apart and rebuild them however they wanted. Club culture became an escape.
An escape from that bleak reality.
But, and this is the most important part of the London story, we can't not talk about acid jazz without talking about immigration.
Right. The source is very clear that this wasn't just white British art school kids making noise in a vacuum.
Far from it. The heartbeat of this scene was the Caribbean and African diaspora, the Windrush generation and their children. They brought reggae, they brought funk, they brought a deep knowledge of American soul.
So these rare grooves we talked about, they were essentially the record collections of their parents.
Precisely. This music was playing in their living rooms. When that immigrant culture collided with the British art school bohemian scene, you got a smark. Without that multicultural blend, there is no acid jazz.
It's a sound that could only happen in a city as diverse as London.
Exactly.
It's amazing how often iconic British sounds are actually the result of that multicultural blend.
Wow.
The source also mentions specific venues, Dingwalls and the Wag Club. These sound remarkably unglamorous.
Oh, they were sweaty. They were packed.
Yeah.
But they were laboratories. This wasn't happening in stadiums. It was underground. And it was fueled by pirate radio.
Pirate radio, like broadcasting from a ship.
Literally, sometimes. Or from the top of a tower block in a housing estate. The BBC wasn't playing this stuff initially. Enthusiasts had to hijack the airways to get this black music heard. Eventually, the movement got so big, the mainstream couldn't ignore it.
And it wasn't just the sound, was it? Looking at the photos in the article, there's a definite look. I'm seeing turtlenecks, berets.
It's a very specific vibe. The source calls it the urban aesthetic. It was a mix of the 1960s mod culture-sharp Italian suits, scooters blended with modern urban streetwear.
It was about looking sharp in a gritty city.
Dressing for the job you want, not the jet you don't have.
Exactly. It was aspirational. It was about dignity and style in a tough environment.
Right?
So we've got the look, the politics, the clubs. Let's talk about the bands. The source highlights a few key players that define this British sound.
There are 4 heavy hitters here that really shaped the genre. First up, you have Incognito. The source calls them the most important band of the movement.
That's a big claim. Why them?
Because they provided the musical legitimacy. Led by Bluey, that's Jean-Paul Monic, they weren't just sampling, they were incredible musicians. Flowing horns, powerful female vocals, driving percussion. They proved this wasn't just a DJ trick, it was a real musical evolution.
Then you have the Brand New Heavies. Now, I actually remember them. They were on the radio.
They were huge. They had this very polished, groovy, soulful sound. And they were so successful, they actually broke into the U.S. R&B charts in the 90s.
Yeah.
Do you know how rare that is for a British band?
To sell R&B back to America, that seems impossible. Usually the traffic goes the other way.
Incredibly difficult, but they did it. They had the authenticity.
The guy with the big hats. We have to talk about Jamiroquai.
You can't talk about acid jazz without Jamiroquai. JK. He took that funk and acid jazz bass, but he added 2 things that turned it into a stadium filler. First, immense pop star charisma, and second, ecology messages.
Ecology messages. In dance music, save the planet while you boogie.
It sounds strange now, doesn't it? But yes, songs about the ozone layer, about protecting the earth. It was pop with a conscience. It resonated massively in the 90s. It gave the music a sense of moral purpose that went beyond just looking cool.
And the last one mentioned in this section is Galliano.
Galliano is interesting. Produced by Gilles Peterson himself, this was a fusion of rap and jazz. They brought a stronger street color to the genre. Think of it as bridging the gap between beat generation poetry and modern rap.
So London is booming, the scene is huge, but this didn't stay in London. And this is where the MMR article actually surprised me. I assumed this was just a British fad. But the section on the geopolitics of groove paints a totally different picture.
This is the most fascinating part for me. The music didn't just spread. It interacted with local economies and politics in very specific ways. It's like a case study in globalization.
Let's start with the United States. The source calls the U.S. expansion a reverse import. Can you unpack that?
That's a great term. I mean, think about the ingredients of acid jazz. Jazz, funk, soul. Where do those come from?
The U.S., specifically Black American culture.
Right. So the UK took those American ingredients, repackaged them, gave them a cool new name, acid jazz, and a British accent, and then sold it back to the United States.
That's brilliant marketing. Hey, America, you forgot you had this cool stuff. Here it is back. But now it wears a turtleneck.
Essentially. And because the U.S. had the originals, the term acid jazz was seen as this fresh, exotic branding. It was adopted in clubs in New York and Chicago, but in the U.S. it connected heavily with hip-hop.
The source mentions D-Light. Groove is in the heart. I never thought of that as acid jazz.
It's right on the border. It served as a bridge. In the U.S., acid jazz connected with the jazz hip-hop movement, a tribe called Quest, Gangstar. It was less about live bands in suits like in London and more about the sampling, the beat, the loop.
Okay, so that's the West. But the source makes a huge point about the East, specifically Japan. I had no idea this was big in Japan.
Oh, Japan is central to this story. You cannot understand the global reach of acid jazz without Japan. In the late 80s and early 90s, Japan had a massive club jazz movement. And you have to remember the economic context there.
The bubble economy.
The bubble. Japan's economy was skyrocketing. Real estate prices were insane. There was a culture of high consumption, extreme sophistication, and a hunger for Western cool.
And acid jazz fit perfectly into that.
It was stylish, it was complex, it was foreign.
It fit the lifestyle. It was the soundtrack to spending money.
In a way. It aligned with the Shibuya-kai scene, this very collage-like, fashionable music scene in Tokyo. And Japan didn't just consume it. They produced world-class acts. United Future Organization, or UFO, Kyoto Jazz, massive.
I love those names. United Future Organization. It sounds very sci-fi.
It reflects that optimism of the era. And Japan became a bridge. They were importing records from London, remixing them and sending them back. It was a true cultural exchange.
So you have this triangle, London, New York, Tokyo. But what about the rest of Europe? This is where the geopolitics part really kicked in for me. The source explicitly links the spread of acid jazz to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It's a correlation we often miss because we focus on the music, not the history. But acid jazz peaked right as the Cold War ended.
So freedom tasted like jazz funk.
In a way, yes. In Eastern Europe, and specifically in Berlin around the reunification in 1990, there was this sudden influx of new culture. This mix of jazz, which historically represents freedom and expression, and electronic music, which represents the future.
Yeah.
It was the perfect soundtrack for new, open Europe.
It was the sound of barriers coming down?
Exactly. In France, you had the Nouvelle Scène jazz.
Yeah.
In Germany, it mixed with the experimental techno spirit. And then you have the South Italy, Spain.
The source mentions Ibiza.
Right. There it mixed with the Balearic beat. It became the sound of the chill-out room.
Ah, the chill-out room. The place you go when the techno is too loud and you need to rethink your life choices.
Precisely. But think about the networking effect here. Globalization allowed London's immigrant culture to spread through these world city networks. It's like the music rode the wave of the borders opening up.
It was a symbol of freedom and exchange in a post-Cold War world. That's actually quite profound for a genre that started as a joke about acid.
It really is. It was a genre that said, the world is open and it has a groove.
So what happened to it? Because let's be honest, if I walked into a cool club in London today, they aren't playing incognito. Did it die out?
It didn't die. It did what all biological things do. It evolved. By the late 90s, the initial scene calmed down. It morphed. It split into new jazz, lounge, broken beat.
And elevator music.
Unfortunately, yes. Some of it got diluted into generic background music. That's the danger of being sophisticated. Sometimes you just become wallpaper. If you listen to a hotel lobby playlist today, you are listening to the watered-down grandchildren of acid jazz.
But the source argues there's a revival happening right now, where I'm not seeing Jamiroquai hats on the subway.
Open up YouTube. Search for lo-fi hip-hop beats to study relax to.
Oh my God, that girl studying in the window with the headphones? That's acid jazz.
Musically, it's the direct descendant. The source notes that the relaxed texture, the jazzy chords, the slow boom-bap beat, the nostalgia, it connects directly to acid jazz. Young listeners are finding these old 90s tracks and realizing they fit the modern mood perfectly.
It's Intellectual yet danceable all over again. Or maybe intellectual yet studyable.
Exactly. And it influenced serious jazz, too. There is a direct line from acid jazz to the modern jazz revival we see today. Look at artists like Shabaka Hutchings in London or Kamasi Washington in the U.S. They're playing serious jazz, but they understand the club. They understand the groove.
Acid jazz made that crossover possible.
It broke down the walls between high art jazz and low art dance music.
That's the legacy.
That's it. The article calls it a crystallization of sound. It converted urban diversity and sophistication into a groove that everyone could understand.
So why does this matter? Why should our listener, who might be driving to work or doing dishes right now, care about a 30-year-old musical trend?
Because it wasn't just a trend. It was proof that you could respect the history of black music, the jazz, the soul, while completely reinventing it for a modern technological world. It's the ultimate hybrid. It's respect for the past, but living very much in the present.
And doing it with style.
Always with style.
We've covered a lot of ground today. From the gritty streets of Thatcher's London, through the neon lights of Tokyo, to the chill-out beaches of Ibiza, acid jazz wasn't just a genre, it was a mood. A mood born from friction, immigration, and economic change.
And it proved that you can feed your mind and move your feet at the same time.
Which is the best combination. But here's something I want to leave you with, listeners. A thought that hit me while we were talking about the Berlin Wall and the opening up of the world.
Go on.
The source argues that acid jazz was the soundtrack of the world opening up. Cultural liberalization, borders falling, the 90s optimism.
A global party.
Exactly. But today, it feels like we are in a world that is closing off. Borders are tightening, trade is getting complicated, walls are going back up. The vibe is very different.
It certainly is.
So if acid jazz was the sound of the world opening up, what is the soundtrack of our current world? Is it fragmented? Is it isolated? Or are we due for another intellectual groove revolution to bring us back together?
That's a very powerful question. Maybe we need that groove now more than ever.
I think we do. Thanks for listening to this deep dive into the world of acid jazz. Keep digging in the crates.
Good night.